I'm Claudette with They Call Me Martha, and I have a two-part video series today showing you how you can take Spellbinder dies and use some simple coloring techniques to create two beautiful cards. Let me start today's video by reviewing the products I'm using. I'm working mostly with Spellbinders, a few different die sets, as well as an embossing folder from Simon Says Stamp. You can use any one that you may have. For our first card, we're going to use the 4-petal Thank You, and also the Essential Arches. And then for our second card, we're going to use the Essential Arches, but shift over to this flower set called Sealed Blooms. Then I'm using several different colors of Copic markers. You can use any kind of marker you have, or you can do ink blending if that's a preferred medium for you. And then I'm also using Tumbled Glass in the Distress Oxide formula for our background sky. And in addition to the dies, I'll also be using some heavyweight white cardstock and also some gold cardstock by Simon Says Stamp. I'll link all of that in the description below. All right, let's get started with our first card. And while I'm setting that up, I do have a favor to ask you. If you are inspired by my content today, I would very much love for you to become a subscriber to my channel and help me grow my channel further. And then also, if you could give me a thumbs up if you like my content, that would be helpful as well. All right, let's start by scoring our card base. I have a standard top folding A2 size card base. So this is currently 4 1/4 by 11. And I'm just going to score it in half. And then I'm just going to fold and burnish that. And set this aside for later. Next, I've cut down several pieces of white cardstock to 4 by 5 1/4. We're going to cut our arch shape several times from this panel. So I'm using the arch that is just shy of 3 1/4 inches wide and about 4 1/2 inches long. And I'm going to show you how I set up a little template here to do our die cutting. So the key here with this design, if you're using paper to add dimension, and let me bring my example back in, you need to make sure that all of your edges are lined up. So if you were just to cut this panel several times with the arch die, it will most likely not line up on the edges. So you need to make sure that you're cutting it in the same place every time. So what I did was I positioned my die where I wanted it on my card front, taped it down, and ran it through my die cut machine. And that's where I get my first die cut. After I've cut my first arch, I want to use this now as my template. So I'm going to make sure my die cut slots right back inside that window, and I'm going to tape it down a second time and just make sure that it is really secured. This is going to become my template. So every time I cut a new panel, the arch will be in exactly the same place, and I'll have my edges line up nicely when I glue them together. So next, what I've done is I've taken my card panel. Again, these are 4 by 5 1/4, and I'm just going to line up my outer edges with my template. And then I've also added a piece of tape to the back of my card panel, and I'm just going to wrap that around my template just to make sure it's super secure. And then I'm going to run this through my die cut machine. Okay, so now I have my panels that are cut in exactly the same size. Now I cut this die shape, I would say 5 or 6 times. The more you cut, obviously, the deeper the dimension that you'll get on the arch, and the thicker your card front will be. So it's up to you how many layers you want to do. I'm using about an 80-pound cardstock. You could also use even a 100-pound cardstock and stack them up. That would be nice as well. And then we're going to begin to build our card front. So now I'm going to move to my flowers. This is what they look like from the die package. I'm going to cut this main piece at least twice for my cardstock so that I can stack it and get some added dimension. And then I'm going to cut these flowers at least twice, as well as the leaves, so that we have quite a few to work with as we begin to color. So off camera, I have cut a bunch of those flowers out, and I just want to share with you a couple of tips, things that I do that make the coloring easier. The first tip that I have for you is don't punch the die cuts out of the negative piece of cardstock. This will help you color. It's easier to color on a flat surface than it is to try to work with these tiny little pieces. So what I do is I pop them back in if they've come out, and then I just use some low tack adhesive on the back to kind of keep them in position. So here I've cut 3. I may only end up using 2 layers of each one, but I have an extra just in case. And then I'm going to use some Copic markers to do my coloring. You can do ink blending if that's better for you. You can do watercolor coloring if you have cut this out of watercolor paper. But what I'm doing is I'm just going to come in and very easily shade the flowers with at least 2 colors of marker so that I get that added dimension. And I'll go ahead and in the item description, I'll go ahead and pop in all these colors. So here I've picked 3 kind of rose or coral colored Copic markers, and then a couple of different yellow-green markers that I'll use for my leaves. And then I have 1 brown marker that I'm going to use for the stem. All right, so let me show you how I do my coloring. And if we look back at my example, there's a couple of different layers to the flowers. Spellbinders does a really good job of doing the work for you, right? So they've given you a base, and then they've given you a dimensional layer, and then when you stack them together, this is how you get this effect. I'm going to color this base layer here with my darkest color because this is what's going to show through. And because this is the base, I really don't need to shade it. So just doing some quick coloring across the die cut is about all you need. And I'm going to do all of them while I am working with this color. Another thing I do is oftentimes I will cut more than I need. So if you're already cutting it once, you might as well cut it a few more times in case you need additional flowers, or in the future, you already have flowers already cut and colored and it would be easy to assemble a card. All right, I'm going to come in with another layer of this color. It does dry back a little bit, so I want to make sure I get a nice deep color. And then I'm going to focus on this layer. And here I'm going to use a lighter color on the edges first, and then I'm going to come in and shade part of it as well. Now this little center piece right here is a separate layer, and that piece I'm going to color the darkest of my 3 so that it really stands out. So here, again, I'm just adding in some of that lighter color on one edge, and then I'm going to come in with my darker color and do the other side. And this will give us some of that added dimension that we're looking for. If your flower pops out of the negative space, just push it back in and it should be just fine. So here I'm coming back in and coloring that center. I'm going to give this several layers of ink so that, again, that center flower really stands out when we build them. All right, while those dry, I'm going to move to the smaller flowers here. And I'm going to do the same thing that we did with the top layer of these flowers. I'm just going to come over them with the lightest color. And you can see here how easy it is to color the flowers if they remain in the card panel that you cut it from. And then I'm going to come back in with my mid-tone and just hit some of those edges on those flowers. These are so tiny, you really don't need to spend a whole lot of time making sure that you're shading it just right. I think just a hint of that darker color on some of the edges is about all you need. Okay, now I'm going to come back in one more time and go over the whole thing and blend those colors together. And then I'm also going to come back to the top layer of these larger flowers and just smooth those out with our lightest color one more time. All right, now we can move on to our leaves and our vine. I'm going to start with the vine itself. You can do this die a couple of different ways. You can do the vine in brown so it looks more like a branch, or if you wanted to keep this looking like an ivy vine, I would do it in a green. So here I'm just working with a medium brown. This is E44, and I'm just going to color the parts that are just the base of the vine or the branch. And then we're going to layer in the greenery on the leaves, and this thing will really come to life. All right, now I'm going to move over to my leaves, and I'm just going to start by coloring the base of the leaves the darkest green that I have, and you can use any color combination that you like. This one is YG67, and I'm just adding a little bit of that green. It's just going to peek through a little bit once we start to layer everything up. So I don't need to worry about shading or anything like that. Okay, so that's our branch. It's all ready to go. And what we're left with now are the leaves. And I'm going to use a couple of different greens so that I can get some shading. So here I've got a YG63, and I'm going to use my YG67 again. And I'm just going to go over each of the leaves once with my lighter green. And then I'm going to use my darker green and just bring a little bit of color up one side of each leaf. These little leaves are so small, you don't need to really fuss about, you know, am I shading it just right? All you need is a little bit of that contrast, and I think it ends up looking great. Spellbinders does a really good job of adding the details into their die cuts. So if you're not the best colorist, you still end up with, I think, a really nice end result. All right, I'm going to finish my leaves by blending it with the lighter color one more time across the entire leaf. So now I'm going to begin to build my vine. All right, I've removed just the version that I colored, and now I'm going to glue it to at least one more layer of the same die cut. And for that, I always use wet glue so that I have some open time to wiggle it around and make sure that all of my edges line up really nicely. And what I do is I usually keep this inside the negative while I'm gluing. It's just so much easier to line up this way. And if you need to, you can use a little craft pick to make sure that your edges are all lined up. Some of the vine is very narrow, so just take your time on the step. You want to make sure that they line up perfectly. Okay, I'm going to give that a good press, and for that I always use a dry baby wipe. So this is just simply a baby wipe that I've left out overnight so that it's completely dry, and what it will do is pick up any excess glue that decides to seep out while you were gluing it together. So I actually saw here that I missed one of my leaves, so I'm just going to color that in now. And then if you do see a couple edges that don't quite line up the way you like, you can take your marker and just come back in and color over those edges one more time. All right, I'm going to set this aside to completely dry. You can use a weight, like if you have a paper weight, use that, or I just use usually a couple different acrylic blocks just so that it has a little bit of weight to it. All right, I did decide to add one more layer to my vine just to make sure that it's nice and structured. So I'm just going to remove this now from the negative space, and then we'll do that gluing process one more time. Okay, I'm going to give it a good press with my dry baby wipe, get all that excess glue off. So let's move on to our card base, and then we'll come back and finish our vine and add our flowers. So if you recall, we've cut several pieces of card front using that arch die, and now all I'm going to do is stack and glue them together so that I get that added dimension. So here I've stacked it about 5 times, and I'm making sure that all of my edges are lining up really, really nicely. And then I'm going to set this aside to dry with a weight on it so that you make sure that it's nice and flat. Once it's dry, if you want to smooth out your edges a little bit, you can come back in with a nail file or a sanding block and just go around your edges just for that one little extra bit of detail. So while the arch is drying, I've pulled one of the pieces of the inside of the arch that we cut when we did our panels, and I'm just going to add a hint of color so that it kind of mimics the sky. And so here I'm using Tumbled Glass Oxide Ink and a blending brush, and I just want to add just a little bit of that color kind of more toward the top of the arch, and then extending and blending out as it goes down. I'm going to stamp and emboss my sentiment on the arch before we start to assemble our card. It just makes it easier. And so here I'm just going to line up my sentiment in this lower left corner. I'm using the Thanks for Everything from the My Favorite Things Fall Foliage stamp set. I think it's an older one, so you may not be able to still purchase it, but any sentiment will do. And before I stamp it, I want to treat my cardstock with some anti-static powder. And then I'm using Versamark Watermark ink. I stamp that a couple of times for really good coverage. All right, now I'm going to add some embossing powder and heat set this. I'm using the Brutus Monroe Gilded. Okay, while our sentiment is cooling off, I'm going to cut one more piece for the front of our card. Here I'm using the Matte Gold cardstock by Simon Says Stamp. It is my absolute favorite. I keep it in my craft room all the time. Cannot be without it. I love it so much. And so here I've pulled in the frame that we used to cut our card front. So this is the exact one that we used on step 1. And now I've selected one arch that is one size larger. And so when you tape these together and you run it through your die cut machine, you will get a frame. So just take your time and line up your arches so that they're nice and centered to one another. And then use some low tack adhesive. Take your time on this step, make sure that it's nice and even all the way around, and then run this through your die cut machine. All right, and when you pop this out, you end up with this really beautiful frame that fits the opening perfectly of our card front. So I'm just going to add a little bit of wet glue to the back of my gold frame and add that to our arch. And when I'm working with wet glue, I'm really careful not to use a ton of glue. It could leave a mark on the front of your metallic cardstock if it seeps out. So just take your time. Again, here I'm working with a dry baby wipe. And I'm lining up all of my edges. I have just a little bit of open time before that glue sets up to make sure that my frame is lining up perfectly all the way around. All right, then I'm going to give it a good press with my dry baby wipe. All right, now we can start to assemble our card. So I'm going to bring my card front back in. The first thing we want to do is line up our card panel so that it's even all the way around. And right now I'm just dry fitting it, no glue at all. And I'm just going to tape that down with some low tack adhesive just so that it doesn't shift around on me. What I'm doing is I'm working to get the placement for my inside piece so that it's centered in there perfectly. Okay, so let's just go ahead and glue down our center piece. And here I'm going to use my wet glue again. And I'm going to glue this directly to my card front inside this space here. And you'll feel it kind of pop into place. And then we can remove our frame and then press down on all of those edges. Make sure it's nice and glued down. Okay, now we can come in and do the same thing with the frame. I'm going to line it up right around that piece that I just glued down. Okay, now we can go ahead and finish the assembly of our card. So I wanted to add our vine across the top of the arch, kind of cascading from edge to edge. And so to avoid it having a dip in the middle, I did add some foam tape to the little leaves and parts of the vine that would be in this center area, so that when we glue it down, it has a place to touch the back of the card. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove the backing for all of our foam and then glue this down. All right, now I'm going to add just a little bit of wet glue on top of my foam and also the pieces that are going to touch the edges of my frame. Then I'm going to use my tweezers to kind of help me get my fingers out of the way while I line this up. I'm going to place my weight on top. Okay, now we can finish this card by adding in our flowers. I'm going to start by putting out some wet glue on just my acrylic block and moving it out with my fingers a little bit. This makes it really easy for you to kind of dip these smaller pieces or tap it into it than trying to hold it and glue each piece. So I've just added a little bit of glue to that top layer, and now I'm going to line it up with the layer underneath. I'm going to do that for the smaller one as well. Make sure all your little center pieces are punched out as well before you glue it down. And then lastly, we're going to add our flower centers. And so for these, I'm just going to pop a little bit of glue in the middle of each one. And then add these flower centers to each one. All right. Let's go ahead and remove the flower. I'm going to complete all of my other flowers the exact same way. Okay, have all of my larger flowers ready to go. And then my smaller flowers, I'm just going to pop them out as well. Okay, and our leaves. All right, we have all of our flowers and leaves ready to go. I'll bring my card front back in, and I'm just going to start gluing them in. I'm starting with my largest flowers. So here I'm just going to add my glue and start gluing in these pieces. Now, if you wanted even extra dimension, you could pop up some of these flowers. Here I'm just going to add a small foam piece to the back. And layer in some of my smaller flowers. Okay, now I think I'm going to start adding in some of my leaves. Okay, and then I'm just going to very gently make sure that I've picked up any excess glue on my leaves. And now I just need to fill in with my smaller flowers. I'm going to add one here. Now I'm just going to finish off my flowers with a little bit of added detail. Here I'm using a black Jelly Roll pen just to add the centers to my tiny flowers. And then I do just want to darken up the middles of my little roses here. Then I decided to add some of my favorite stickles. This is Stardust. And I'm just going to go over each of my flowers. I love the sparkle that this gives. It kind of just finishes off the card. And then I think I want to add just a little bit of that same sparkle to the leaves as well. Okay, that is our vine card. I really like how this one came together. I love the dimension on the flowers and the beauty of the gold frame. Be sure to check out part 2 in this series, and I'll show you how to make another cute card with Spellbinder dies.